Good morning, class. Class. Stop! Thank you.
Where are we?
You're in the middle. Between the two. For you. Right now you're in a kind of limbo. You're neither here nor there.
Where are we?
Between light and shadow.
Hi everyone, this is Reba Wissner. Thank you for tuning in for this special episode of Between Light and Shadow, a Twilight Zone podcast. Back in October, I was invited to Ithaca College to give a talk for the Ithaca Music Forum about my work on music in the Twilight Zone. For those of you who don't know, Rod Serling actually had a connection to Ithaca College. He taught for a while there, and so it was only natural that they actually asked me to speak. I'm going to actually present to you my talk in full because a lot of you could not be there and asked if it would be recorded. So I recorded it. One thing I do want to mention that was brought to my attention by the archivist of the Serling archives here at Ithaca is that the clip that I attributed to Sherwood Oaks College, which is how Image Entertainment attributed on the DVDs for the definitive collection, is actually some of his lessons at Ithaca College. So just know that that's actually what's happening. But I hope you enjoy my talk. Please feel free to drop some comments and enjoy.
Good afternoon, and thank you to so many of you for coming out. This is great. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Ithaca Music Forum, the first of 2017, and we are so pleased to bring Dr. Reba Wissner to campus. She is on music history faculty at Montclair State University. She will be speaking about a topic near and dear to Ithaca College. This is, of course, the Twilight Zone, whose Rod Serling taught here for many, many years. Dr. Wissner is the author of the 2014 book Dimension of Sound, Music in the Twilight Zone, and the 2016 book We Will Control All That You Hear, The Outer Limits and the Oral Imagination. And right now she's doing work on music and the atomic bomb in the 1950s and 1960s. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Reba Wissner.
Thank you so much for having me. Quick question, show of hands. How many of you have ever seen at least one Twilight Zone episode? Excellent. All right, if you have not, there are spoiler alerts. I'm sorry. But I don't think that'll be a problem for this crowd. So in order to actually frame how the music in the Twilight Zone works, we need to understand exactly what it is that Rod Serling envisioned the series to be. And who better to actually talk about it than Serling himself? So I have a few clips of Serling talking about the Twilight Zone in some pitches that he did, one for when he tried to originally sell the series to CBS, and one when he tried to bring the series to the Netherlands. And then also an interview he did with Mike Wallace right before the series went on the air. So here's what Serling had to say about the Twilight Zone in his network pitch.
How do you do? You gentlemen, of course, know how to push a product. That essentially is your job. My presence here is for much the same purpose, simply to push a product. To acquaint you with an entertainment product which we hope and which we rather expect will make your product pushing that much easier. What you're about to see, gentlemen, is a series called The Twilight Zone. We think it's a rather special kind of series. Essentially, people watch television to get entertained. And the keynote of this series, the thing we're concerned with, the thing we're aiming for, the thing we're working toward is entertainment. This is a series for the storyteller, because it's our thinking that an audience will always sit still and listen and watch a well-told story.
And then when he tried to bring it to the Netherlands.
What is the Twilight Zone? It's a series of very specially produced, very specially performed, and very specially written stories of the occult, of fantasy, of black magic, and of science fiction. As a professional writer, it's my view that of all the storytelling forms that are extant, the whole concept of the imaginative tale is singularly the most universal of any. To give you a very specific kind of working idea of what we mean by Twilight Zone, you might say that a man is on top of a burning building. Now, there are certain ways he can get off that building. He can use a fire escape, a ladder. He might even be picked up by a helicopter. But in the Twilight Zone, he flies. This is the so-called dimension of imagination. A literary device known by the English writer Coleridge as that willing suspension of disbelief. The things you see, you know may not happen, but at the time you see them on this program, you'll believe that they do happen. This is the Twilight Zone.
And you'll be seeing a lot more of that cigarette, I promise you. One thing that people sort of go back and forth about with the Twilight Zone is whether or not it's actually fantasy or science fiction, or is it a little bit of both? And he also kind of went back and forth with that idea. And you heard him mention here the stories of the occult. So he does a lot of things that have to do with supernatural. One thing I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is how he works with time travel. Time travel was something that was really near and dear to his heart for very specific reasons. But when he was ready to go on the air with the Twilight Zone, he had an interview with Mike Wallace. And at this point in time, he was kind of battling it out with the censors. He had a big problem with censorship because advertisers would find the littlest thing that would be a problem, and they would force him to change things. So, for instance, there was a script for the episode Judgment Night, in which somebody is on a ship and he goes and he orders a pot of tea because it's a British ship. Well, the sponsor was a coffee company, and they didn't like him ordering tea. So he actually had to change it to a tray because he didn't want to sacrifice his creativity, and he sort of didn't want to give the censors that satisfaction. He also had battles with dealing with, talked about social commentary, which, if you know anything about the series, he did a lot. And he did a lot in other shows before that. And so here, when he's talking to Wallace, he's actually talking about dealing with the idea of pre-censorship, or figuring out what the censors in advance may object to and working around that.
Is pre-censorship, though, involved? Are you simply writing easy?
In this particular area, no, because we're dealing with a half-hour show, which cannot probe like a 90, which doesn't use scripts as vehicles of social criticism. These are strictly for entertainment.
These are pot boilers.
Oh, no. I wouldn't call them pot boilers at all. No, these are very adult, I think high-quality, half-hour, extremely polished films. But because they deal in the areas of fantasy and imagination and science fiction and all of those things, there's no opportunity to cop a plea or chop an axe or anything.
Well, you're not going to be able to cop a plea or chop an axe because you're going to be obviously working so hard on the Twilight Zone that, in essence, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, you've given up on writing anything important for television, right?
Yeah. Again, this is a semantic thing. Important for television, I don't know. If by important you mean I'm not going to try to delve into current social problems dramatically, you're quite right, I'm not.
Wrong. Which we all know, wrong. Once he decided that he's going to do this new show, The Twilight Zone, there were a couple of pilots that he had written. One was something that actually wound up getting used in the Desilu Playhouse, in which it's called The Time Element. A man dreams about an atomic bomb dropping on Hiroshima and tries to warn them, and so there's this whole big thing about, seeing the future. CBS vetoed that. Then he had one called The Happy Place, in which you turn, I believe it's 70, and you get put onto an extermination camp. Real happy place. Not. So CBS vetoed that too. So he sat down and he figured out, what is it that I can do that stays true to my vision that will essentially be something that the CBS will pick up. And he wrote the pilot for Where Is Everybody, in which a man named Mike Ferris sees this town he's in. He doesn't remember how he got there. He doesn't remember who he is. And he spends the entire episode trying to figure all of that out. Turns out he's in an isolation box in preparation for a soul trip to the moon. And when he was figuring out what to do with this, he had to figure out exactly how he wanted the music. And so he actually picked up a composer named Bernard Herrmann, who at that point was very famous for film. And Herrmann not only scored that episode, but he also scored the first season theme. So what Herrmann did was what a lot of these composers did. They sat down and they watched what's called the rough cut, which is the cut of the film that has nothing except for the dialogue, and figured out exactly where he thought music should go. And he took notes. Nowadays, it's very easy for people to do that because they can take a DVD of the rough cut home and watch it endlessly and often. Back then, you had to actually sit in a studio room and watch it and then get it right at least 2 times. And then he had to figure out exactly what it was he was going to do. So in addition to actually writing the music for Where Is Everybody, he put together this theme. And the theme is very true to Serling's vision of fantasy, kind of this hazy music. So for those of you who do not know, this is also going to be the opening titles. So it just lasted for season 1, and I'll explain why in a couple of minutes.
There is a 5th dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
So it's really very simple. It's these harp arpeggiations with some brass. And it was Herrmann trying to figure out exactly how to make what's going on in your ear reflect what's going to happen on the screen. At a certain point, and there are various stories about this, CBS decided that the Herrmann theme was kind of boring. And so there are actually 3 different stories as to how the Marius Constant theme, which is the most famous theme that everybody knows, actually started. Story number 1 is that Lud Gluskin, who ran the CBS library, decided to put out a call for a contest and have people submit scores for this new theme for this new TV show. And I'm actually using those words because he called it a new TV show. Meanwhile, it had been on the air for almost a year at that point, so it wasn't exactly new. Offering $300. So Constant said that what he did was he submitted something, and he suddenly got a check in the mail, and he didn't know anything really that it was being used until somebody came to Paris and started fawning over him. And so you were the one that wrote that? That's story number 1. Story number 2 is that Gluskin actually took 2 library cues, étranger and milieu, and spliced them together to create the theme. So these are actually part of the cue sheets for seasons 2 to 5. Instead of actually listing the main title and the end title, it actually has including étranger number 3 and milieu number 2. The third story is that somebody who worked under Gluskin decided that he was going to splice some of the cues together and go through the library. None of these people are alive anymore, so I can't tell you what's what. What I can tell you is this is actually the constant score for étranger number 3, the Ozolid. And so we can tell from these cue numbers, in this case 813A, that it was in the library at some point in the early 1950s. So whether or not Constant actually reworked his own music, we don't know. His son I've been in contact with, his son doesn't know. All of his papers that relate to the Twilight Zone are somehow gone. So nobody has anything. It makes things easier. Yeah, exactly. So the best dating we can have for about 813 is that it somehow showed up in the library around 1951 or 52. And I'm going to talk about the library in a little bit, so hold that thought. But the whole idea for this theme is something that you all know. It's kind of like this earworm, for lack of a better word, that gives you this idea of creepiness. So what it has, for instance, the étranger number 3 has your percussion and your guitars, and then you also have for milieu number 2 the bongos. That manuscript is gone too. So this is all we got. Put it together, and this is what you get.
You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
So some actual recordings of the Twilight Zone have the end of season 1 retroactively applying this theme, even though it was technically not used at the end of season 1. But this is what everybody really knows. So when you get down to the nitty-gritty of the scores, there are 3 types of scores, not just in the Twilight Zone, but pretty much any kind of score for TV in the 50s and 60s, Star Trek or anything like that, Outer Limits. First is original scores. So going back to my idea about how composers would sit down and watch the rough cut. Before that actually happened, sometimes you would have Lud Gluskin or Eugene Feldman, who worked with him, figure out whether or not they can actually get away with reusing music. And part of this had to do with budgets, because these shows didn't have very big budgets, nor did they have a lot of time. So when a composer wrote a piece of music, whether it's specifically for the library or for a radio show or another TV show, they would sign a contract that said that we can use your cues however we like. We can even take measures out, put measures in, vary the tempos, vary the instrumentation, so that we can have as many different kinds of cues as possible to reuse whenever we want. Which is why sometimes you'll notice that some of the music cues are actually reused. Sometimes they're actually reused in a very specific context. But if they felt that there was no music that could possibly convey the kind of idea that's present in the episode, they would have a composer sit down and write the original score. The next one is the stock scores, which is comprised entirely of those library cues. And then you have partial scores, in which you have a bunch of original cues that were composed, but some of the library cues actually interpolated in. And again, that had to do with budgets. Another problem with the budgets had to do with the unions. And at a certain point in the 1950s, the music unions found it too expensive to pay for recording overseas. In the US. So people go overseas. And there was a great story that Fred Steiner, who wrote a bunch of the Twilight Zone and also Outer Limits scores, said that Gluskin would go to Mexico City and have the orchestra rehearse and perform a score for recording for about 1/3 less than it would cost to have it done in the US. And then what he would do is he would take the recording and slap a sticker on it that said it was done in the US. He got caught, obviously. And it didn't bode well for him. But this is the kind of thing that they're doing for saving money. So we're going to start off with the original scores. So these are actually all of the composers that wrote for the Twilight Zone and the number of episodes they scored. You'll notice that, where is he? Nathan Van Cleve wrote the most at 12. And in fact, the episode we're going to screen at the end, which is The Midnight Sun, has a Van Cleve score. And then you also have Jerry Goldsmith, who did 7, and Bernard Herrmann, who did 8. There are some outliers. So for example, Franz Waxman did one called the 16 millimeter Shrine. How many of you know that one? Okay, some of you do. The 16 millimeter Shrine is actually a truncated version of Sunset Boulevard. And Waxman did the score for that. And some of it is actually very reminiscent of what's in the Sunset Boulevard. But one of the reasons why he had to modify it is because cinemas had giant speakers, and TVs sometimes at best had a 4-inch speaker. So he had to figure out what would actually come through on the screen. And he actually said that he would sit down in the viewing environment of whatever he was writing to try and figure out what would best sound. So that was completely deliberate. Or Tommy Morgan, who is a famous studio harmonica player. So chances are any episode from CBS or even ABC that has a harmonica in it is played by him. And so sometimes he actually wrote the scores for that too. He's still alive. I believe he's about 98 or something like that now. He's very, very sweet. Robert Drasnin also, he did one score, but he also worked in a supervisory role in that he was one of the people that put together some of these stock scores. He unfortunately just passed away about a year ago. So Tommy Morgan is the only composer who is still alive. All of these, unfortunately, others are gone. So returning to the idea of Serling and time travel, Serling had a lot of nostalgia in him. He always wanted to go back to where it all began. In fact, Walking Distance, the episode with the carousel and seeing himself as a child, with him really being very nostalgic for his hometown of Binghamton. And so obviously he taught at Ithaca. He also taught at Sherwood Oaks Community College in California, and he taught a few other places. And this is actually one of the classes that he taught at Sherwood Oaks, talking about how and why he uses time travel.
Very often I find that within the framework of the science fiction or fantasy genre, the use of traveling back in time is a very effective way of producing contrasts, of producing a kind of a freewheeling storytelling device, which is why I used going back in time. And there's another reason, which very much relates to any discussion of creativity, is that every writer, and I don't think there are any, I can't conceive of anybody not falling into this pattern who writes, has certain special loves, certain special hang-ups, certain special preoccupations and predilections. In my case, it's a hunger to be young again, a desperate hunger to go back where it all began. And I think you'll see this as a running thread through a lot of things that I write. And part of creativity, of course, is being able to have the capacity to convey that kind of hunger, that kind of nostalgia, that kind of bittersweet feeling to those who have never had it.
So it wasn't just going back to his childhood. He often ruminated about going back to the quote-unquote good old days. And so with the 16mm Shrine, you have an actress who spends her days in her screening room watching her old movies. And her agent, Danny Weiss, who is Mutton Balsam right there, tries to get her a part in a film. And she finds out she's supposed to play a mother. And she doesn't want to have that. So she decides she's going to lock herself away and she's going to pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist. And so one day, her maid, Sally, comes into the screening room to give her hot chocolate, and she sees something that she probably should not see. And that is Barbara is now on the movie screen in her screening room. Somehow, she managed to go back in time to her old movies. And so what Waxman does is he writes a very sort of hazy kind of music that brings you into this environment of her crossing the boundaries between the actual physical world and the screen. So I want you to listen and sort of get an idea as to what he does. He also plays around with some sort of popular music topics of the 1930s, because again, she's traveling back into the 1930s.
You gonna run it, Mr. Weiss?
Yes, Sally. I'm gonna run it.
darling, is it so good to see you? We're all having dinner by the pool. Please, everyone outside. Oh, Steve, Paul, Jerry.
Barbie! Please, come back, Barbara! Barbie, it's me, Danny. Barbie, come back! Please, Barbie! Barbie! Come back, Barbie!
And he goes out in the foyer and surprise, his scarf is right there. And also, if you know anything about Sunset Boulevard, the final scene in which she comes down the stairs with her arms stretched out, mirrored exactly here, except instead of having her fan, she's having her co-stars. So then you get the delightfully eerie, The Invaders, in which a woman sees these little men, or these little aliens, coming out and basically trying to attack her. But she finds out at the end that they are from Earth. They're the US Air Force, and she is an alien. But the entire time, there is no dialogue at all. So Jerry Goldsmith actually remarked that this lack of dialogue was something that he wanted to capitalize on. It had to tell the story without giving away too much, so that if you listen carefully enough, you can sort of anticipate what Serling is doing. And for this cue, Counterattack Part 2, because there's a Counterattack Part 1, he anticipates the suspense of her trying to get back at this little alien that she thinks is trying to kill her. And he uses a lot of atonal music in it, which right then and there, compared to a lot of the other cues in the Twilight Zone, is very, very different. So right then, it sort of tells you that something is just not right. Goldsmith, incidentally, wrote a lot of music that sort of featured the whole orchestra. The Invaders was nothing but 12 strings. So he used a very different ensemble than he usually does as well. Then you have what's affectionately known as the twists. A lot of these episodes are not what you expect until the very end. One of which is The Eye of the Beholder, with a score by Bernard Herrmann. And Bernard Herrmann, again, he did Where Is Everybody? He did several other episodes. He did, for instance, Living Doll with Talkie Tina. And this one, like a lot of his scores, he writes several cells, usually motives that are about 4 notes long, and he manipulates them throughout so that every cue is based on one another. This particular episode features those pig-faced doctors, where they're the ones who are normal, and she, the beautiful Donna Douglas, is not. And so here's where she's unmasked. And what he does is he takes this motive that he's presented at the beginning, he spins it out on the harp until that twist happens. And then you get the cue Hysteria, in which there is a leader, which some people who have done a lot of work on this I've actually compared him in his rhetoric and certain other features to the way that Hitler spoke with conformity and the idea of the outsider being bad. So the music is dubbed at a very specific level such that you can only hear certain words. And it's really only if you look at Serling's script that you can get the entire gist of what's actually happening. So this is The Last Bandage and Hysteria.
Transfer you to a communal group of people with your disability.
You'll make me go then.
That would probably be the case. Now remain very quiet. Keep your eyes open. All right, Miss Tyler. Here comes the last of it. I wish you every good luck. No change. No change at all.
Afraid of this. Turn on the light.
Needle, please.
Land of the earth and we know now that there must be a single purpose, a single norm, a single approach, a single entity of people, a single virtue, a single morality, a single frame of reference, a single philosophy of government. We must cut out all that is different like a cancerous growth. It is essential in this society that we not only have a norm, but that we conform to that norm. Differences weaken us, variations destroy us. As incredible political this norm is what has ended nations and brought them to their knees. Conformity, we must worship and hold steadfast. Conformity is the key to survival.
And so now she's going to be sent to a communal colony for people with her disability. The episode was originally called A Private World of Darkness, and if you watch the end credits, they actually never changed it. At the beginning it says Eye of the Beholder, but it says Private World of Darkness at the end. Another famous twist is the Midnight Sun. I'm not going to give away the ending, but what I will say is the main character, Norma, is in New York, and it just keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And it builds to a fever pitch, so that what Nathan Van Cleve does is he loves using the organ, and he loves using reverb on the organ to give it a distorted sound. So this is the second to last scene of that. And I want you to listen to how he plays around with the reverberation on the organ as it keeps getting hotter and hotter. So you got that same pattern play on the organ and on the piano. And it gets faster and faster and faster. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter. So the intensity is actually mirrored in the music. So then you have the stock scores. So as I mentioned, the music actually gets put into the CBS library once it's recorded. And then CBS has a catalog. And the catalogs are actually in two different forms. They are called the Easy Q library, as in letter E, letter Z, letter Q. And they were released on about 150 LPs at one point. So there's a lot of music there. And so with those LPs, you get the library Q. So for instance here, you get library and then a Roman numeral. That Roman numeral will indicate the year in which the Q actually went into the library. And so this is just another version of it. So you have a binder like this, and then you also get some microfilm that had these. There were also cards when they used card catalogs back in the day, where you could go into the card catalog and find where the Q was. You could locate it by the library number and then the real number. And it's a little hard to see, but what you get are the title of the cue and the composer, the takes. So for instance, you could have a take 1, take 2. In this case, take 4 went into the library and not take 1. Or you get versions, and then they have a description of it. So for instance, soft, strange, ethereal background, then it goes straight to the tail. Some of them are downright cliches where they have entire reels that are of like Native American music and African music, and sometimes they're too cliche that they're actually painful to listen to. But this was the 50s and 60s, so that's what happened. But they all have a name. So for instance, this particular one, Reel 47, it's called Sneaks to Dramatic Tags. So if you wanted something that was going to go, for instance here with the dramatic background, you have a really dramatic scene, you'll find the notebook that has dramatic backgrounds, and then you can choose. There are some that are like party songs and country dances, and so you literally, all you had to do was look and see what the title is and figure out what was in there. So some of the music from radio shows went into the Twilight Zone. For instance, Bernard Herrmann did some scores like for Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which got used in a few. Also Moat Farm Murder, which is about a murder. But you also had the music that came from the Twilight Zone that was reused in other episodes. So for instance, you have the cue Chris Walks from 100 Yards Over the Rim, in which Chris is trying to find his dying son some water. They're in a wagon train. He goes over a rim or a hill and finds himself in the future, only to discover that his son is going to live and be the doctor that creates penicillin. So here he is going over into the future. He has no idea what those things are. In fact, he sees a truck and he calls it a giant metal horse because he's never seen one before. So you have that ostinato that's, again, with the ostinati, sort of anticipating and building the suspense. So it was reused in several episodes. Sometimes it's kind of literal. So for instance, in the very first clip here from 5 characters in search of an exit, they're looking for a way out of this circular room they're in, and they're literally trying to get out over it. So this is a montage of all of the Chris Walks cues in the Twilight Zone.
Kate, what'd you do to my dog?
Nothing.
What do you mean nothing? I was standing right here. I saw you.
You leave me alone.
I'm not going to leave you alone till you tell me what you did to my dog.
You've seen them. Little towns tucked away far from the main roads. You've seen them, but have you thought about them? What do the people in these places do? Why do they stay? Philip Redfield never thought about them. If his dog hadn't gone after that cat, he would have driven through Peaceful Valley and put it out of his mind forever. But he can't do that now. Because whether he knows it or not, his friend's shortcut has led him right into the capital of the Twilight Zone.
Come in, my dear.
Is the unknown. And here are two characters about to partake of the meal. Miss Charlotte Scott, a fashion editor, and Mr. Robert Franklin, a state trooper. And the third member of the party, the unknown, that has just landed a few hundred yards away. This person or thing is soon to be met. This is a mountain cabin, but it is also a clearing in the shadows, known as the Twilight Zone.
So, if you noticed, some of the cues only use certain things like individual chords. Some of them, for instance, in Valley of the Shadow, was slowed down. So these are the kinds of things that they did to try and make things multi-purpose. The other one are cues that went into the library straight for the library's sake. Here we go back to Marius Constant again. A lot of his cues actually went into the library before he even had that theme. And so one of the famous ones is brouillard, which translates to fog. I actually had to cut some of the episodes out. I couldn't show all of them because it equals 10 minutes. That's how often that this cue is used in the 5 seasons. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to play the production recording for you, straight from the CBS library. And the voice you'll hear is Lud Gluskin, who's conducting it. And he's going to announce the cue number so that when they file it away, they can figure out which one it is for easy access. And then one of the takes. And he'll tell you what take it is as well.
1006, brouillard, take 1.
So here, Constant's actually writing for alto, flute, clarinet, oboe, and bassoon, leaving out the strings. He also has some vibraphone in there as well. And again, that pattern that is circulating around to give a sense of haziness. So here are just some of the episodes that use brouillard. One thing to note is that the episodes that use it tend to have it come in when something weird or strange happens.
Well, how do I look? Well, isn't that nice and so clear, Chet?
Calls himself Samuel Conrad. And he will remain here in his cage with the running water and the electricity and the central heat as long as he lives. Samuel Conrad has found the Twilight Zone.
It's not for sale. Why not?
Well, I don't know.
This car we were just sitting in. Well, that's the one you were pushing.
Yeah, sure. But I guess I'm not pushing it anymore. This is a wreck. It's a rum-dum. It hasn't got any points, hasn't got any rings, hasn't got any plugs. And it'll eat gasoline like it owns every oil well in Texas. But the tires are very bad. And the chassis has been bent. And if I said anything about it being a runabout, why, I meant it run about a block and then stop. And it'll cost you double what you pay for it when you start taking it in for repairs, and you'll start taking it in for repairs every third Thursday of the month.
Well, what else have you got?
Oh, what else? Well, I haven't anything else worthwhile to show you. Everything in this lot should have been condemned years ago. I got more lemons per square foot than a fruit grower in Salinas. And what you ought to do, you ought to hit one of those reputable places and get what you pay for and something you really like. But you shouldn't come around here anymore.
Strings.
No strings?
You better trot out the strings, buddy boy. Trot out the strings. I want to know what I'm getting.
Well, $22.50. The car as is, and
what?
The car's haunted.
Haunted? The car is haunted? So it's haunted. I swear, you're the cleverest cookie in the... You ought to be in politics.
Far-fetched, way out, tilt of center, possible, but the next time you buy an automobile, if it happens to look as if it had just gone through the Battle of the Marne,
Could you make something move that's a little smaller, like a quarter, maybe?
Sure, the smaller, the easier.
All right. Give me a quarter, will you? Now make that come up heads. Give me a 7.
Pulse normal?
So the parallel is really the exception to this whole thing. With the most unusual camera, the camera takes pictures of things that happen before they happen. With the whole truth, anybody who owns that car can't lie, which is why he's brutally honest. And the very last clip of that, it sounded a little bit like a folk song. He sells the car to Nikita Khrushchev. Again, this is the height of the Cold War, so that he can tell the truth. So they rearrange Brouillard so that it actually sounds like that. So these are just some examples as to how the Twilight Zone's music actually works and fulfills Rod Serling's vision. So thank you so much.
between light and shadow.